This video is brought to you by Wren. What's up, guys? Michael here to unpack the wild two-part finale of Season 5 of Rick and Morty. The last two episodes dropped back-to-back, putting a bow on a season that's been a little all over the place, featuring incisive commentary on things like climate change, an objectively dumb detour into incestual space babies, and a lot of bird-based content in between. And not to reveal ourselves as overly predictable political philosophy nerds, but Episode 10 had our ears pricking up when the show explicitly talked about capitalism.
It's a metaphor for capitalism, Morty. What do you think?
Twice.
Wow, I thought my capitalism metaphor was on the nose.
So what are the writers trying to say? And is what they're saying actually smart? And above all, did it effectively tie up this wild season? Let's find out in this quick take on Rick and Morty. Are we free to imagine? And as always, spoilers ahead. But before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Wren. If you're paying attention, which you presumably are, then you're no doubt growing more and more concerned about climate change. And many folks are wondering what they can do, and specifically how they can cut back on their own carbon footprint. Wren is a website that helps you calculate your carbon footprint and then shows you how you can offset your footprint by funding projects that do things like plant trees and protect rainforests. Wren knows that you might not have the time and energy to spend your weekends getting sweaty and dirty planting trees, so they make it easy for you to help fund those projects. I was excited to learn about Wren's Biochar in California project, which removes dead trees from redwood forests with high fire risks and turns them into biochar, a stable form of carbon that lasts for thousands of years. As someone that lives in California, it feels good to know that Wren has projects that directly impact important local issues. So to get started, all you have to do is answer a few questions about your lifestyle, and Wren will calculate your carbon footprint and help you reduce it. Sadly, a zero carbon lifestyle is impossible, but Wren can help you offset what's left over. Once you sign up to make a monthly contribution that will be used to offset your carbon footprint, you'll receive monthly updates from the projects you support, so you will actually see the impact that you are making. We all know it's going to take a lot of work to slow down the climate crisis, so why not start today? We've partnered with Wren to plant 10 extra trees for the first 100 people who sign up using our referral link. So go to www.ren.co/start/wisecrack4 to join us in saving the rainforest and fighting the climate crisis. That's ren.co/start/wisecrack4. And now, back to the show. Now, this season of Rick and Morty, arguably more than ever before, is really focused on relationships between characters. And are those relationships healthy? Of course they aren't. Things are just as toxic as ever between Rick and Morty, Rick and the rest of the Smith family, and Rick and a recently resurrected bird person, just to name a few. Most obviously, Morty is stuck in Rick's endless cycle of abuse.
Dad!
Summer, you fucking idiot. We're not decoys.
Why did I get punished?
He's constantly belittled, with Rick even replacing him as a sidekick with a pair of crows, which he picked through a Price is Right style spinning wheel just to be a dick.
I never said you're worthless. In fact, I've given you a very clear metric of your worth. 2 crows.
What's more, Rick only seems to care about Morty when he can get something out of him. Hell, the entire reason they adventure together is because Morty's dumb little brain provides Rick cover to hide from his enemies in the multiverse.
When a Rick is with a Morty, the genius waves get canceled out by the, Morty waves.
Their relationship seems to be largely transactional. So when Morty does break away from Rick in these most recent episodes and seemingly bonds with this guy Nick via their portal orifices, it seems like he's finally found a partner who will respect and value him. But not so fast. Eventually, we find out that Nick was also just using Morty, specifically to get access to Rick's fancy tech. Morty has to literally sacrifice a hand to escape this new abusive relationship. All the action of that movie 127 hours, but in 3 seconds. Meanwhile, Rick starts training his new pair of winged sidekicks to whom he serves a similar platter of condescension and low expectations, seeing them as only valuable for the various services they can provide. And when we get to the Citadel, now run by evil President Morty, we find a world of rampant subjugation, with hundreds of gruesome Mortys laboring underground to power a cheerful futuristic metropolis/massive weapon where President Morty lives in well-protected luxury. Things only get darker when we learn that tons of Jerrys and Beths have been manipulated into mating in order to produce ever more Mortys to keep the merry Citadel functioning. They've essentially been instrumentalized to provide an endless supply for the so-called Morty market. So what does all this have to do with capitalism? Before you accuse us of being depressingly obsessed with the economic system that everyone in pop culture loves to hate, remember that the show drops the big C word twice. First, when Rick produces a weird Rick-haired blob who seems to get off on experiencing Rick's battle wounds.
It's a metaphor for capitalism, Morty. What do you think?
And then it comes up a second time.
Wow, I thought my capitalism metaphor was on the nose.
But let's go back to the blob for a second. If we're to see the show as being sincere, or as sincere as you can be about a masochistic blob, we could see the entire Citadel as a critique of capitalist economies, a manifestation of the harshest imaginable version of the capitalist system. It's a world built and sustained on class bifurcation, i.e. the separation of a society into two separate classes, where one gets to drink wine while the other never sees the light of day. Here, the blob gets off on being defamed, off of basically being tortured and abused to facilitate Rick's craven pursuit of power. Power he couldn't obtain without a lower class Rick blob to take the punches for him. The show is seemingly telling us that anyone who wields power is usually doing so on the backs of something much uglier. Indeed, each network of relationships that we see in the Citadel is built upon pure exploitation, a larger scale version of the kind of exploitative individual human relationship Rick and Morty have shared for all these years. Unfettered capitalism here becomes a metaphor for abusive relationships. And it seems like they might be setting up an infinite cycle, where abusive relationships lead to exploitative systems, which lead to abusive relationships, and so on. And this repeats endlessly, in a seemingly infinite number of dimensions, with a seemingly infinite number of Ricks abusing Mortys without owning up to their cruel behavior.
None of them have to be responsible. They're all victims of themselves. Oh, it's so hard to be a genius.
In fact, we learn that Mortys are literally bred to be forgiving, which reinforces the cycle of abuse.
Jeez, you guys really are bred for forgiveness.
Rick pathologically behaves like a dick. Morty pathologically forgives him, and so the cycle can begin again. In a universe dominated by all-powerful Ricks, there are only so many ways that any given Morty can behave, so many choices he has in how he responds to his material and emotional conditions. Similarly, some critics of capitalism argue that the economic system thrives by offering all of us plebes the illusion of choice, while simultaneously limiting our imaginations for what is possible. This is what scholar Mark Fisher identified as capitalist realism, i.e. the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. This seems contradictory, since so much of capitalism is based on supposedly rational actors making choices about how to interact in the free market. And sure, there's a free market. We can pick from any of hundreds of healthcare plans. But chances are, most of those plans will cost about 33% of your income, so how much choice do we really have? And like most people, most Mortys don't see any choice other than to work within the system. Our central Morty accepts a world where Rick has power over him, while constantly trying to convince Rick to practice basic human decency. Morty's stuck in his own cycle of forgiveness of Rick's abuse, followed by hope that Rick will eventually do better. His choices are severely limited by the relationship structure created by Rick's evil genius. That's where Evil Morty comes in. Motivated by the emotional damage of seeing Rick instrumentalize Morty after Morty for his own purposes, he seeks to break out of this infinite loop. To imagine an existence outside of the Rick-mandated universe is where a blue-headed geriatric jerk runs things. Good Morty versus Evil Morty's approach to the problem of Rick's abuse is like the difference between asking your exploitative boss to treat you better versus seeking out a new universe where bosses don't exist. Evil Morty is obviously otherwise super evil. It's hardly incidental that his goals are dependent on the forced labor of hundreds of other abused Mortys. But can we really break these cycles of abuse and arguably abusive social conditions that can accompany capitalism? The show investigates that question in several ways. First, we see Rick unexpectedly form an empathetic relationship with his crow's sidekicks when he learns how smart and badass they are. Rick stops seeing his bird friends as mere tools to serve his ends and sees their intrinsic value. Problem solved, right? Not so fast. We eventually find out that the crows were actually using Rick as a rebound after breaking up with a very horny scarecrow.
What do you mean using me as a rebound?
This relationship had always been transactional, and Morty seeks out equality in his friendship with Nick, who it turns out was just using him too. The show seems to suggest that even the most apparently heartwarming relationships still can't transcend systems of transaction and exploitation. Except for maybe Beth and Jerry, but that's a topic for another day.
Dr. Wong suggested we experiment.
We've been watching pornography together.
Gross.
I might never come back.
And then we get to Evil Morty, who's characterized as evil not because he's turned everyone's portal guns into murder machines, but specifically because he wants to break out of the Rick-ruled system. But this raises a question. What if Evil Morty's desire to break free is the one good thing about him? Arguably, he's freeing his imagination to consider not just making improvements to the Citadel's brutal reality, but tearing the whole thing down and freeing himself. The show even makes the limitations of imagination inside Rick's version of reality literal through the central finite curve, which separates all the universes where Rick is the smartest from all the universes where he's not. On the side of the curve we know, Rick will always abuse, Morty will always forgive, and there's no alternative to this system. Some scholars would call this analogous to the way we view capitalism in contemporary society. Any variation on capitalism is possible. Heck, the United States will even demand it from certain countries in exchange for humanitarian aid. But while you can revise capitalism any which way, the adage attributed to Frederick Jameson remains. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But the show eventually seems to suggest that Evil Morty's search for a reality outside the cycle of exploitation is a valuable goal, with the season concluding as he blasts into a different unknown universe, presumably not run by any version of Rick. So maybe the show's writers are once again using the animated multiverse to get us to reflect on some of the nihilistic tendencies baked into our own society. Maybe they're digging even deeper into the dark depths of Rick's relationship to Morty. Or was this just a way to cram 5 seasons worth of canon and lore into a couple of episodes so the next season they can just get back to dark, wacky, serialized adventures? I guess we'll all have to wait and see. But what do you guys think? Is Rick and Morty slyly critiquing capitalism, or just throwing us off the scent with the occasional reference? What's next for Evil Morty? And is there any real alternative to capitalism? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support. Hit that subscribe button like you're milking your own clone for blood, and don't forget to ring that bell. And as always, thanks for watching. Later.